Okay. So if you remember the 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we were supposed to do the virtues and I completely forgot and skipped over them. So rather than just say that outright, I just played it off and we'll just slide them back into here, which is fine. But remember like kind of where we're at, right? So we said Catholic ethics isn't so much concerned with individual acts, but more about, and not as if those don't matter, but more about the proper means for forming our character, right? Becoming a certain kind of person, right? And that doesn't mean, again, that our individual actions don't matter, but just like it's about happiness and about becoming a certain kind of person, right? And so this week we're going to look at the virtues and we're going to classify them so that we can kind of see how they fit into like the overall scheme of our fulfillment. And if you remember, I think it was the first week we talked about how we have natural desires, right? Things that move us to do things, right? And so what I want to do is go back to that a little bit and start with the nature of desire itself so that we can kind of see where the moral life fits in with that, okay? Okay. All right, so these are sort of bigger words, but they'll begin to make sense. So what I want to do is sort of talk about our emotions, our passions, where they come from, and then we'll talk about what governs them and how we use them, all right? Because so remember, emotions and passions are good, right? God gave them to us. They're not something that is something that's bad, nor is it really something we should be suspicious about, but it is something that we need to learn how to use them correctly. All right. So they're meant to kind of put motors behind our actions, right? And I think we talked about how when you do something with no emotion, right, it comes across as really cold and almost kind of weird, right? And you know, having someone will my good while doing it like in a totally heartless and unfeeling way is, well, probably pretty freaky, rather than you know, on the receiving end of it being an act of charity. Okay, so St. Thomas makes a distinction, sort of Catholic anthropology picks up on this. When we talk about appetite, right? Appetite is just a fancy word for desire, right? And we have two sort of types of appetites. We have what's called the intellectual appetite. So our will is what draws us intellectually towards the good. And then we have what's called a sensitive appetite, which is our passions, which are felt in and through our bodies. And so both of these are ordered to the good. Remember, we talked about how the will is always fixed on the good, big picture, but requires the intellect to tell us what the particular good in this particular time, this particular place is, right? And so we can sort of begin to define passions as synonymous with emotions. It's a little deeper than that. But they're essentially a source of influence on our actions, right? How we feel about something often affects the way we go about doing the thing. And we can immediately, when we use, this is why we use the word passion, right? The word passion has the word passive, right, in it. So as if something has to act on them to activate them. So the question is, did you have a question?
Where are you leaving this room? For us. Oh, I thought you were going outside.
It's gotta always be Hayden. Oh, he muted himself. Too late, man. We heard you. So, all right. So, passion. I have no idea where I just was. Yeah. So passions have to be acted upon, right? And so they can be acted upon by objects or by our intellect, right? So we can activate them. And there's two essentially kinds of passions. What's called concupiscible, and those are more, we'll unpack these a little bit. Those are ordered to a sensible good or evil. And then there's irascible. Irascible passions are those that are also always ordered to the good, but they're meant to sort of recognize that good is often hard to achieve and evil is often hard to avoid. All right, and I promise this won't get too heady. So let's look at the concupiscible appetite, the passions. All right. All right, so let's just say we see some object that we desire. All right, or we see some object. All right, and we're gonna move towards that object. So somehow we've discerned that that particular object is good, right? And so the first sort of emotion we feel is love, right? Not love in the sense of like an intellectual love, we will or good of another, but a desire to have that thing. All right, and if we move towards it, well, desire is felt. Okay, if we get the thing, we get pleasure. All right, that's it. So there's this sort of 3-step process. And we'll see why this is important in a second. And the same thing, we see something that we know is not good. And so we naturally have an aversion towards it. And so we recognize it bad, we experience hatred, we have an aversion to it, where we want to move away from it. And then if for some reason we can't get away from it, we experience sadness. All right, so think about anything, right? Think about you see a dog chasing you, right? The first thing you go is, I hate being bitten, right? You feel hatred for being bitten, right? And then you experience aversion to it. So we can call it fight or flight. You experience emotion of aversion where you want to move away from it. The dog bites you and latches on, you feel sadness, right? That's essentially, and then the other way around, right? I see one of Aaron's cookies, and I look at the cookie and I go, that is good. I love those cookies. And then I really desire to have another one. And then I get the cookie and I experience pleasure, right? That's how we work, right? Not that complicated. And is that clear? I don't want to like overcomplicate this because I want to tie it to our immortal life. All right, so let's see if you at least understood this. And some of you will already be able to answer this question, but I'm okay with that. All right, so knowing that the concupiscible passions it's just a simple inclination towards something that is good for us, right? So like I use the example of a cookie, right? So we have this simple desire to eat, right? We have this simple desire to procreate, right? Where we remember the 4 sort of natural desires, right? All of those sit in the concupiscible appetite, all right? So we're naturally drawn to those things, all right? That being said, why does St. Thomas say that fasting is the guardian of chastity? Go ahead.
Since fasting sort of like denying yourself and sort of denying sort of like your
Be specific, like denying what?
Denying food, which
Mhm.
is something you desire.
Mhm.
And chastity is sort of denying that I desire to or desire for intercourse before, or just impurity before marriage. It's sort of like a similar thing, sort of denying yourself.
Okay. So we're going to come back to your definition of chastity and we're going to get a better one, but that's not bad. Go ahead, Keegan. So you have more or less have it, but I think Keegan's going to finish it because he's heard me say this probably 35 times.
The desire to procreate is like higher or more powerful desire than the desire for food, sort of. And so if you, like Patrick mentioned, they're kind of the same kind in some ways, but they're of different degrees. And so if you can practice almost the virtue of self-discipline, I guess you would say, like in the one of lower degree, which is food, and you can fast, then you're strengthening yourself to take on the higher challenge of fighting against lust. Right?
Yes. So to sort of cap off both of what you said, so those desires, the desire for food and desire for sex, are in the same exact place in our soul. Right. And so by controlling that particular appetite, we can control both. All right. And we start with the easier. And so if you can control the easier, it becomes easy to control the harder. Yes.
People's appetites in the soul and the body.
They're in the soul. They're in the soul. Even though they're experienced through the body, right?
Would that mean you like it? Would that mean you get hungry? Or just like having?
No, so hunger is felt in the body, but the desire for food is in the soul. So that it has a different effect on the two things, right? So, I mean, hunger is a signal to your soul that you should desire food, but the desire actually sits in your soul.
This is why I'm saying people cannot be hungry and still desire food.
Yes. Yeah. Otherwise, they could, like, this is where, like, you don't see like cats binge eat when they're nervous or something, right? Like people do that though, right? So yeah, so it's in the soul. All right. So the reason then that chastity, like virtue of fasting, it's a virtue, is a guardian of chastity, is because those desires come from the same place within our soul, as if there's a physical place, but just the idea of them being under the same powers. Okay. And if you learn how to control the power, you can learn to control it in both directions. Okay. That makes sense? All right. So let's look at the other passions. Yes. No. All right. So the good is something that is difficult to achieve sometimes, right? Like, for example, I want to get in those cookies, but I'm really like all thumbs and can't flip off the top, right? And so I start to get angry because I can't get to the cookies, right? That's my irascible appetite, right? So there's a good there. I want it, but something's going to have to get me through the obstacle of getting the top off, right? And so, so there are, again, I can hope to get the top off, but if Aaron has glued the box closed, then I will feel despair. All right. So I cannot get the cookies. It's a good that I desired, and now I cannot get it. All right. It's gonna get a little ridiculous, I guess. So then I am going to get the cookies. And the fact that I can't get the top off of it then makes me anger. I experience anger. All right. And while I begin to realize I'm never going to get that cookie, I experience fear. Right. But in the midst, before I get to fear, is the courage to continue to fight on to open the top. This is where it starts to get a little silly. All right. Yes.
So since absent goods are present evils, in the sense that, like, if I don't, the fact that you can't get off the cookie is an evil, but it's also just the absence of good. What's the difference between hope and, I guess we know there's a difference between hope and courage. One doesn't want to apply and the other.
Yeah, well, it's because I used a crummy example, right? Like it's not really an evil that I can't get to the. Oh yeah, I guess I didn't mean it that way, but it would be like I could come up with a better, like some things, like go back to the dog example. Like if the dog is threatening me, I have courage to run away from the dog out of fear that the dog I'm not gonna be able to conquer it. And then the dog actually catches me and I'm really angry and want to kick it across the room, right? It's probably a better way to look at that. Hope would be more to assuming the cookies are good, right? Like I can't get the top off, but hope is the engine that keeps me going. And then despair is when I'm like, oh, I'm never gonna get that cookie. All right, does all that make sense? All right, so yes, Stuart.
Why can you explain the bullet where it says in a no present good difficult to attain?
Yeah, so remember how I had this broken up here where I had it essentially each one has an opposite, right? Once I have the good, now I'm back here at pleasure. Right, so anger doesn't really have an opposite, which, by the way, is why the strongest emotion all of us have is anger, because it has no opposite to temper it. And these do depend on our temperament and our bodies, all right? How acutely we feel these things. And we'll talk about temperaments next semester. Yes.
This might jump on what you said, but I guess I've noticed myself, there are certain times where, like, I think it mostly happens with bad emotions, but you're angry and you're angry and you see a way out of the anger, but you actually enjoy, like, let's for instance being, or you're sad, like sad is probably when we were like, you're sad and you know you could, like, I could just move on, but you actually like being sad.
Yeah. The question is, why do we stay in our, like, negative emotions,
is there, like,
right?
pleasure in, like, staying?
Yeah, because emotions are pleasurable, right? Like sadness, especially when it's appropriate, is actually makes us feel better. And so if we're like, why would anyone watch a sad movie if there wasn't pleasure in being sad, right? So if the object that it's attached to is really sad, like, sadness is good. That's why, like, St. Thomas says, tears are, like, he calls them, forget it. It's basically like it's like bathing the soul, right? So sadness is, all these things are good, like, even though their objects may be negative, they're good, right? Because anger, like, motivates you to fight evil. Like, without anger, it'd be like, honestly, like, we live in a like a generation where, like, people don't even know how to be angry anymore, right? Like, and that's a defect, because there's lots of things we should be angry about. And that's not like we go like wrath mode, but that's just the reality. Like, if certain things happening, I don't need to be like, if abortion doesn't make you angry, there's something wrong with you. Like, you're not wired correctly. So that's the point, right? And that's why it's having a healthy understanding of our emotions is really important, because they're there for a reason, right? So that's the point. Yes, Aaron.
Seems like it'd be better, like, if your, like, spouse got hurt, like, you shouldn't be like, it'd be better to be sad about it than to be like, well, it's all in God's will, and just be completely detached from it.
Well, you can do both, right?
Okay.
Yeah, you could, like, think of Our Lady at the foot of the cross. It's just like the perfect model of it, right? Like, it's totally, like, abandoned to God's will, but felt sadness that we can't even begin to imagine, right? In a certain sense, it's like, I don't know if you ever, like, when you're praying the rosary, you meditate upon, like when she's sitting at the foot of the cross, like, she knows where all this ends up, right? And I'm like, why didn't she just, like, say to herself, this too shall pass, right? Like, and in a couple of days he'll be back. Like, that to me would be like, if Broken Rob goes, yeah, that makes total sense. Like, what is she getting so upset about? And then you're like, oh, wait a second, like, actually that, like, shows more love, because it's in the present moment. She feels it, and she feels it more acutely than I can even begin to imagine. I think that way because my sadness hasn't been purified and I'm trying to avoid it. Where she is like the full human offering of herself includes, like, sadness, right?
So how do you, unbroken yourself, if you feel like you don't have enough of these?
How do you unbroken yourself? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. That's ultimately, like, that's what we're going to talk about in a second. So we'll come back and in a minute, yeah, and we'll talk about how to unbroken yourself. We'll talk about it in a second.
Yeah, I guess we could just say fix.
Kevin, that's genius. If only someone would invent a word that means unbroken, but isn't so awkward. All right. So here's the question. So how many of you heard, like, oh, I can't control how I feel? Yeah. Is that true?
Depends. I mean,
Well,
like, there are some things that if you're broken enough you can't control, but I'd say there's always something that you can control.
what do you guys think? Yes, Patrick.
Well, I think if we're properly formed in our passion, like, then we're sort of controlling our passions in a sense that we are sort of like, they're inclined to basically be doing what our will and like ourselves.
Yeah, what's that word? No, there's a word that,
Unbroken.
no, it's not, it's not unbroken. What's the word? So what you're describing is exactly right. There's just a word to define when you're formed enough. What is that word? Do you know? Yeah, it's virtue, right? All right, so the answer to the question is, can we control our feelings? And the question is, can we control our feelings? The answer is sort of yes and no. All right. So St. Thomas makes a distinction between what's called antecedent passions and consequent passions. So I'm on a bus, right? And somebody walks by and they're carrying a stick and they slam my foot, right? And I'm like, oh, and I'm like immediately mad, right? Immediately angry. And then I look, and the idiot's wearing sunglasses on a bus in the middle of the afternoon on a cloudy day. I'm like, oh, this guy's a real idiot. Like, so now I've engaged my reason, right? Allegedly. And so I get up and I hit him, and the guy standing next to him goes, dude, you just hit a blind man. And then suddenly I'm not mad anymore because I realized, oh, that wasn't even on purpose. So then I engage reason and go, stop being mad because you also hit a blind man. So at a certain point there, right, my emotion switched from antecedent to consequent, where reason went, oh yeah, you should be pissed at this dude, thinking he's all cool wearing sunglasses on the bus. And you haul off and hit him for hitting your foot, right? So antecedent emotion, the emotion precedes the action of the will and induces the will to consent such as anger or hatred, right? So I experienced anger because it wasn't really a stick, it was actually his walking cane, and he slammed my foot. And then I make a free decision to act. So now I'm feeding the beast, right? Yes, Connor.
Somebody who's perfectly like an Adam and Eve, were all emotions consequent? Because I've heard someone say that all antecedent emotions are due to attachment.
Yeah, so all antecedent to kind of go where Patrick was going a little bit, is to use the words. Antecedent emotions, the more virtue you have, the less they occur. Because what virtue does is it gets emotion under the control of reason and will, right? And so like the Blessed Mother, if she was on the bus and that same dude hit her foot, she would not get angry first. She would be able to control her control her emotion to the point that she could then reason that she should feel sympathy or feel whatever, right? Yes.
But would all of Mary's emotions be thought out before she had them?
Yes. So they were perfectly, you remember my model that you guys always make fun of, where I was so proud of this one little slide where I'd taken like the powers of the soul. Elizabeth, you're laughing like you remember it. And I had them all move around, and I was like, and Keegan said, you designed that? Like, how long did it take you? And I was like all proud until Keegan totally smashed it. So in the perfectly integrated soul, right? Intellect, will, passions.
Yeah. So in my mind, you have to work at that, and you order your passions through your intellect, your will, passions, and you develop virtues and things. Take like chastity, for example. But like the chaste man, I wouldn't imagine that the chaste man would have no feelings towards his wife until he intentionally willed that feeling. Like he has willed the feeling in the past by building up the virtue, but I would imagine that it would just kind of be.
Yeah, so that's the positive aspect of chastity, though. So the chaste man would, in a certain sense, has to will it. Like it isn't just like
it wouldn't be like
no, there's no like there's no deliberation, right? That in a lot of that's the habitual part of virtue, right? No deliberation, but his wife is the only object that causes that response in him, because he's trained his emotions to only respond to her. In that way, when the circumstances are correct, all of that. Yeah, like this. So we haven't talked about this yet, but passions, right, are sort of habitual in the sense of like, if you have trained yourself, every time I see a plate of food, I go and eat it. Like I'm gonna immediately, like it's like Pavlov's dogs, right? Like we're all like that, right? If I don't ever put that under reason, it's going to go out of control. And then so that immediately if I see a plate of food, I'm just going to skip to gotta have it. But the man who is temperate actually engages reason and says, can even just look at the food and go, that looks good, I'm not hungry, or that looks good, and doesn't feel desire to the food. And so that's where we're getting to, right? Yes.
But I guess like you, and I think kind of like repeating with the one true to the point that at the beginning it might require like a real act of the will and vocal like thought process, but at the end, like Mary didn't sit at the foot of the cross and be like, hey, my son's being crucified, I guess I should probably be sad now. You know, she recognized and was sad.
Yeah, because she had the virtue of prudence, which we're going to talk about. And so she knew when to exercise sadness in the right way, in the right proportion, at the right time, in the right circumstances. Right? And so that's why like her sorrow at the foot of the cross is greater than any sorrow we could ever experience, because it was perfectly under the control of her reason. Yes, right.
So to clarify, similar to like the chase man, like it's ordered only to his wife, or if you're Mary at the foot of the cross, she'd have to cross. Okay, I should be feeling sorry right now. Like those emotions can come instantaneously, but because they're ordered, like that calculation's already done through reason, they are considered as consequent.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but even so, like, get a little ahead of ourselves a little bit, but because the virtues are all interrelated, right? So that the chaste man who isn't prudent isn't really chaste. So for him to experience an attraction to his wife while she's, I don't know, in the emergency room with an appendix, like that's imprudence, right? Even if he is supposedly chaste, right? And so he does, without the virtue of prudence, he really doesn't have chastity either, if that makes sense. Right. So like even just so what if my only attraction is to my wife, but if I can't control when I do that, then I'm lacking prudence. And it's not necessarily a thing of chastity, if that makes sense. All right, so let's talk about virtue, what it is, and then what it isn't. And so here's the definition. Virtue is a firm and habitual disposition to do the good. All right, and so what virtues essentially do, at least the moral virtues, is perfect our appetites. Right, that's why I used the word appetite earlier. Right, so two of the cardinal virtues perfect our bodily appetites. One perfects the intellect for practical decision making, and one perfects the will, which is justice. All right, and so the four cardinal virtues. So real quick, just a couple of things about virtues. So virtues, there's four cardinal virtues, which I have listed there: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And so cardinal just meaning simply like the word is in Latin is cardo, it just means hinge or door. So it's the four virtues upon which the moral life hinges. Think of it that way, right? And there aren't only four virtues, right? So there's a whole bunch of sub virtues under these, and virtues are different in their object. I don't want to make this overly complicated, but I think St. Thomas lists 64 different virtues, moral virtues. I could be wrong about the number. But he plays the game. He's like, okay, is chastity the same exact thing as temperance? And he essentially says no, because their objects are different. So that they're just different in their objects. And so temperance, all the sub virtues of temperance control, the concupiscible appetite, and then fortitude, and all the sub virtues control the irascible passions. All right, and we'll talk more about that in a minute when we get more specific. Yes, Erin. I could. Yeah. Yes.
That's kind of a silly question, but why? Like, so some of the major virtues, like take humility, or let's just say humility. Like it, like if you talk about humility a lot, it's one of the virtues most people struggle with. But yet it's just like a sub virtue to temperance. Like why? I guess. It may kind of a silly question because guys the way things are, but I guess are these? Do you understand why I'm kind of like confused by that?
Yeah, like why certain virtues are harder.
I guess why are certain virtues that you think are like seem very important just seem to be like sub virtues of like you would think, okay, temperance is more, yeah, I guess it's more like humility is a part of temperance.
Yeah, no, so I think it's more of just what the idea that virtues, like essentially there's oppositional vices, and because pride is the strongest, humility becomes the most important. I mean, I think that's the only reason why. But if you go back to what I said about them all being interrelated anyway, and really if you like, Aristotle uses the idea of like spokes on a wheel, right? And if you pull out one spoke, what happens? Well, the whole wheel collapses, right? And so, so in a certain sense, like if you don't have one of the virtues, all the other ones will suffer eventually, and to the point of you really won't be able to exercise them. So the ranking of them is not as important per se, although we'll talk about prudence in a second, why that's the case. All right, so let's talk about, so the definition, remember, was a firm and habitual disposition to do the good. So let's talk about habits. St. Thomas says the habit of virtue cannot be brought about by one act, but by many. Like, well, okay, so we tend to think, right, what's a habit? Like something we just do sort of almost compulsively, right? Like chewing my fingernails. So the word habit, what he's getting at here, right, isn't something that, like, if I chew my fingernails once, is that really a habit? No, like it's something repeated and almost automatic in a certain sense, right? Not completely automatic. We still have control over it, but we are creatures who have habits. Like we're wired that way. We're wired to do things habitually. And so habit isn't necessarily always a bad thing, right? Even though we tend to use it in that way. It's the way we're made. Yes.
I think I know the answer to this, but I want to. So somebody, I think maybe not so much in a critique of virtue ethics, but in a kind of speaking to it, they said something about how, okay, so we think of Mary. Like Mary was the most virtuous, like all the action did was perfect, and she was the most pleasing to God. Yet, in a certain sense, she did all of it by like grace habitually. Like there was no point where she was like, I mean, maybe you can correct me wrong, but there was no point where she was like really stuck in this like hard decision of like, do I do the will of God or do I not? Like she had the grace, she always chose to do the right thing and knew to do so habitually. Yet there seems to be this kind of tendency, and that's where we look at somebody who maybe struggled to do something right in a certain sense, like, oh, they overcame a greater, they were like almost more virtuous because they struggled to do what was right. If you see what I'm saying, they had to have a greater moral. I think I know the answer, but if you want to talk about it, like why?
Yeah, so I think the question is, if I could kind of summarize it, is essentially like why Mary's virtues were better than somebody who actually has to struggle through them. Right?
Mary's an extreme case, but even in the sense like, because we think about like habit, we'd say, okay, somebody who's habitually, and like take chastity as an easy example. Like you say, the guy who just has the virtue of chastity, like just doesn't, like you said, like in the ideal, or it may not be ideal, but in the perfection, he just doesn't even, it's just not even interesting. You know, he just moves right past it. Where the guy who doesn't, like really struggles and makes a conscious choice every single time, okay, I'm not gonna go and whatever. And we kind of, again, there's a certain like amount in which we look at the one guy, the guy who's really struggling, we're like, wow, he's really working. Like he's, whereas the other guy almost like, is he, is it really impressive? Like he's just not, like he's just totally not even like bothered by it.
Yeah. So the mistake is not, what makes something good is not the effort, but the ease, right? Think about that for a second. Like if something is really hard for me versus like some moral action is really hard, for someone that's really easy for, that's actually their act is better. Like, so that's the first thing I think you have to get in your mind, that, okay, actually the one who does it promptly and easily, actually, like that's a better action than the one who goes kicking and screaming, or, or even just like kind of dragging themselves. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is to make sure that we don't sort of confuse like supernatural virtues, like what we call maybe infused virtues, versus like natural virtues, right? So in Mary's case, for her, natural acts of prudence, like, okay, what's the best thing to have for dinner? Beans, or I don't know, fish, whatever, right? Like even those acts were perfect, but not because they were enlightened by grace, right? But because she had a perfect human nature. Now, supernatural prudence as to, okay, the question of which brings more glory to God, beans or fish? That's now a supernatural level. And so that she had grace to enlighten to say, okay, fish is the better, for the glory of God, fish is the better thing. Because, someday Jesus is going to hang out with a bunch of fishermen and he should really learn how to like fish. I don't like, whatever the reason is, right? So we have to make sure we make the distinction between supernatural and natural virtues. Okay, so a habit simply just disposes us to act in a certain way. All right. And so again, I don't want us to get hung up on like when I sort of make the distinction between like judge the good, do the good, feel the emotion. Like it's really all one thing. Like there's no like long. And so when we have a habit, when we have a virtue, it disposes us to do it much easier. So there's no internal resistance to doing the good thing. All right, that's all this is what we're sort of getting at. Okay. And so when it says it's a firm and habitual disposition, it just means that it disposes us and it makes it easier to do the good. All right. So the person who is honest, has the virtue of honesty, it is way easier for them to tell the truth than the person who has, the vice of lying. Yes.
Is there always an aversion to suffering?
On a bodily level, yes. But when you can control the emotion of fear, then, and you say you have the virtue of courage, suffering doesn't even begin to enter. Like the man who's perfectly courageous, suffering doesn't enter into the equation. Like he doesn't feel fear at all. He just sees the good. Prudence judges to do it. And, so the courageous man who's really courageous feels no fear running into a burning building because he's already judged that it's the right thing to do. Yes.
I have two questions.
No.
Like someone who is like, I don't know, like in the dark night of the soul, like really far along their spiritual journey, like have they not built the virtue of religion because it's really difficult for them to pray and make acts of faith or the virtue of faith? And then secondly, I feel like anytime like someone is having like it's really difficult for them to pray, like priests always counsel you and say, well, this prayer is more pleasing to God right now because you're choosing to do it when it's difficult. So do you say that's like not true? And it's actually like most pleasing when you're choosing it when you're doing it with ease? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
it's both of them are true. Like
Okay.
it's really both true. It depends on where you're at. So like, and even just being in the dark night, right? So the active night would be where you are actively working to root out like obstacles to grace, which means essentially you're trying to grow in virtue. Whereas the passive, God is now getting the rest of them out, getting the rest of the defects out. And those defects could be in the virtue of faith, but it could be in other things too. And so some of the sensible experience of God goes away completely, or even awareness of God. I can't say for sure, like, okay, it's him purifying faith per se. It's just him purifying you. And it could include faith or not. Did I answer both questions?
The first one, yeah. The second
Okay.
one, you just said like sometimes it is more meritorious to struggle to pray versus just to do.
Yeah, depending on where you are. So like, again, someone like, far into the illuminative way, like when they pray, like they're completely docile to the Holy Spirit, which is way more pleasing than the person who is like fits and starts at the end of the purgative way. Right? But the person in the purgative way, it's way more pleasing for them to battle through prayer than to not.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean.
So I guess the good example that I was talking about earlier with the person who struggles, because I'm sure we've all been told being courageous is not about not being afraid. It's about being being brave. It's about like standing up to fear when you feel it. So the question is, I guess, are so all these virtues in the intellect, in the sense like it's just a matter of like perfecting your judgment, or some of them in like the passions where it really is?
Well, no, so virtues aren't in the passion. The moral virtues, except for prudence, is in the will. So the will can, like, over time, the virtue of courage will be, through the virtue of courage, you will be able to control your fear. So courage isn't feeling the fear and doing it anyway. Like, that's totally wrong, because what that's essentially saying is that you have this antecedent passion that you then somehow get it under control or ignore it or whatever. You do not have the virtue of courage if you feel fear, right? Because fear would be like, yeah, yeah. So that's why. What was the second part of your question?
Okay, so are all the virtues in, I guess I can start answers, but like, so to chastity is an example. Like, is chastity is it all in the intellect where you're just like,
No, so temperance, remember, is in the will, and everything, all the sub virtues. Courage and all the sub virtues are in the will. But prudence directs, like, this is why we'll talk about prudence being the charioteer of the virtues, right? Prudence directs when and how much chastity needs to be activated, for example.
So yeah, so my question is, when we say it's in the will, does that mean your passions just become to the point where they're actually, because I think I've heard a distinction made trying to chastity. I think I've heard the distinction made between like continence and chastity in the sense that continence might be in the will in the sense that you're like choosing when is appropriate basically to be into somebody,
Yeah.
versus chastity, which is in like the passions where it's like you just when you feel an attraction or not.
Yeah, chastity controls the passions. So just think of the moral virtues as those two moral virtues as controlling the passions, so that we get to the point where we can actually command them, right? Yes, Patrick.
So sort of like how we were talking about before, how like the ease of the good is sort of more pleasing, like it's more pleasing to God when it's easy to do good.
Mm-hmm.
Then I guess like start thinking about like the parables with like the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son. Why does it seem like God rejoices more? Like if something's more pleasing, like the 99, don't you think that he rejoiced more over like the 99 sheep than that one that's lost?
Yeah. So it's a little bit of a mixture. So when I say it's easier, I only mean it in the sense of interiorly, right? So less interior resistance. So like, I don't know, fighting St. George fighting the dragon, right? Like he had to activate courage the whole way, right? And then the actual act was hard, but he had no interior resistance to it, right? So that would be the first thing. The other part about it being like God rejoicing more in, it's really kind of mixing things a little bit, because like I'll call it a miracle. The miracle of a conversion is like St. Thomas says, it's like the greatest act God can do. So he's actually glorying in something he's doing, not something that they're doing, right? So it's not in the converter, but in the fact that God converts. And so God essentially taking someone who is dead and making them alive causes all of heaven to rejoice. Does that make sense?
So he's rejoicing in himself.
Well, just like God, well, that God only rejoices in one thing, right? His glory, his goodness, right? And so his goodness is manifest more in the conversion of a sinner than a virtuous man doing a virtuous act. But it's so like what I'm more focused on is like the merit of the individual, right? Like when God looks at that person and goes, like, yeah, that is more pleasing for him to be able to do that than for him to struggle through it. Yeah, because exactly. Okay, so just general, I think we've touched a lot of these. Human virtues are firm attitudes, stable dispositions, habitual perfections of intellect and will. So there's different kinds of virtues. There's what's called intellectual virtues, and then moral virtues. So there's, I want to say two types of intellect, but there's two acts of the intellect. One is speculative, the other is practical. So we're going to kind of just set aside the speculative. They just sort of have to do with grasping principles. What we're going to do is focus on the practical, which is where prudence comes in. So virtues aren't just the other part of this. virtues aren't just the power to do good, but it's actually to do good. So they're not just powers, they're actually actions, right? They're habits we have, but they're also calls us to do them, right? Yes, kind of.
It says the moral virtues are acquired by human effort. Is that like, so God obviously infuses like supernatural virtues into us. I guess when we pray, like, you know, for against, if somebody's praying for courage, is it always the case where God, like, is it always the case where God might just give grace to the point where you can act in accord with courage in a certain position? Or okay, does he ever?
Yeah, so like actual grace moves an obstacle out of your way, for example, right? But always towards your benefit. So always towards you growing in courage, because it's you still have to act, even if, you know, the actual grace strengthens your will. And remember, which we talked about earlier today, like, how do I know I have a virtue? Right? I do it with ease, promptly, and with joy, right? So I get pleasure, right? So if you want to know if you have a virtue, next time you do something that resembles a virtuous act, was it easy? Was it prompt? And did you have joy when you did it? Okay. All right, so that's virtue. So let's look at the actual cardinal virtues. 4 virtues play a pivotal role, and accordingly, they are called cardinal. All the others are grouped around them. They are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. If anyone loves righteousness, that is wisdom's labors, are virtues, for she teaches temperance and prudence, justice, and courage. It's sort of the proof text, I think, of the Book of Wisdom, I think. These virtues are praised under other names in many passages of Scripture. Yes.
So that's actually from Scripture?
Yes. All right, so we already talked about them being like where their name comes from. The other part that's important is virtues are what's called the golden mean. So they're always this sort of middle point, not as if we just like they're located in the middle because they're between an excess and a defect. All right, and so for example, we already talked a little bit about this, right? So courage, right? There's an excess of courage, right? You could call it daring, right? Where this person doesn't even think before they do something, they just go running into something, right? That would be called daring, and that would not be a virtue, that would be a vice. But they could also have a defect and they could be a coward, all right? So that would be courage. So each virtue it always sits between two vices, and it's usually an excess and defect. All right, so like justice would have leniency as a defect, and its severity as an excess. Temperance would have indulgence and insensibility. Like insensibility would be like a stoic, has no emotion at all. And then prudence would have astuteness, which is using the wrong means to an end. And then impetuosity, which would be like thoughtlessness. Right, so there's always like 2 extremes, right? And then the virtue sits in the middle. Yes.
Go back to your firefighter running building, which we should say like there's not and someone that running fighters automatically process like, oh, this person is fine, and they go running. What's the difference there?
Yeah, that's probably not a good, like, I think the issue is that's probably not a good example. Like that person like trains for that, that's their job, that like is very, what? Yeah, the question was, okay, so like a firefighter, what would be like daring versus courage? But I mean, you could think of situations where he decides he's going to carry 30 people on his back out rather than, you know, one at a time or something like that, right? Like where it's just like, I'm going to do this amazing thing because it's an amazing thing that totally would be like contrary to prudence, right? Because he's likely not to get anybody out if he tries to carry 3 people. But I mean, you could think of like, I don't know. I mean, people do things like extreme sports or something, like somebody doing, I don't know, I'm going to do a backflip on the ledge of this building. And like, that would be like daring, right? Like there's no courage in doing that. That's just daring because it's not prudent there's no reason to do a backflip on the edge of a building.
fraternity action.
Yes, yeah, and because it's always like, this is why prudence becomes the most important thing, because prudence tells us why we're doing what we're doing. All right, so let's talk about that. Yes, Aaron.
Like a virtue the same in men and women. Men, have more temperance or something than women.
Yeah, it looks different. Like according to like a woman's courage looks different than a man's courage, right? That's in a certain sense, that's the complementarity, right? Where like the fullness of courage somehow looks like a mixture of the two. And probably just leave it at that, but that's a total rabbit hole that we could go down. But yeah, so yeah, the fullness would look different in that. Okay, so prudence is the virtue that disposes practical reason to discern our true good in every circumstance and to choose the right means of achieving it. It is not to be confused with timidity or fear, nor with duplicity or dissimulation. It is called origa virtutum, the charioteer of the virtues. It guides the other virtues by setting rule and measure. To help with this virtue, we apply moral principles to particular cases without error and overcome doubts about the good to achieve and the evil to avoid. All right, so first, we have a tendency to not want to rank the virtues, but in a certain sense, in the practical realm, prudence is the most important, which I've already sort of hinted at why that is the case. And that's why it's called the charioteer of the virtue, which even in just the grand scheme of things, right, like Christ as the wisdom of God, all goodness proceeds from him, right? So all goodness proceeds from prudence. And only the prudent man can be just, temperate, brave, right? And so it sort of is a measure of all the other virtues. What were you going to ask, Connor?
So I think it makes a good point. It's not to be confused with timidity, fear, nor with duplicity or dissimulation. So I think you see this a lot of times, like in politics, where there is a temptation to think like, okay, well, out of the greater good, the long game, whatever, I need to be able to give now, so that I can take later. And we see what it leads to, which is that we just give and never actually take. How do you combat that? Because again, you kind of talked about it a little bit last week, like there's a temptation, to kind of make all these concessions to why, okay, maybe it's not sinful for me to shop at the store that supports Planned Parenthood. That's because it's so remote and it's but I guess is it really good to there are certain moral lines where the church is very clear, like chastity, for instance, where it almost makes it easier because it's so clear as to what is right or what is wrong. With prudence, I think it's easy because of timidity or something like that to be led into this point. You're like, well, it's probably fine. It's probably fine. It's probably fine.
Yeah. So the issue with why you can't be necessarily black and white with prudence is because it's practical, right? It's in the practical realm. Like, what is the good thing to do here and now? But like a lot of these, like virtues, the way we use them tends to be the exact opposite of what they actually mean, right? So for a lot of people, like the prudent thing to do is really the cowardly thing to do. Right? Like people like, well, they wouldn't be prudent to confront this person about this. And what they really mean is like, I actually don't have the courage to do this, right? And so that's what it's talking about, right? So, so it's essentially, think of it as prudence as applying right reason to something that's doable in the situation, right?
So
Go ahead.
I guess my question is less, more in the sense of like, do you have any practical advice for how do we live that in our own life? Or obviously that's a pretty broad question, but because you see, I was just thinking, like, you see, like, just a lot of it, especially this country in general, like, oh, we've gotten a pretty bad place because we've gone very much like.
Yeah. So the prudent person never compromises on principles, like that. Like, so there's parts of prudence, which I think is on the next slide. Like the three parts of prudence are memory, understanding, and foresight. And I don't answer your question after this. Then, so memory is just like remembering what was good in the past, like in a given situation, like a sort of applicable situation, not just from our own experience, but from others. And like a wise man learns from not only just his own mistakes, but mistakes of other people, right? So that's the memory aspect. The understanding, which is what you guys are doing right now. Like you're growing in the virtue of prudence by understanding principles and how they apply. So the short answer is, if you have principles, don't compromise them, right? Like it's just that simple. Now, is that hard? Yes, like all that, but if you, when you begin to when you can control your emotions, like that's the way we were meant to live. Like, what are the principles that apply here? Okay, and how do I apply them? And of course, there's always gray areas. There's always, but sometimes there's not, right? Like sometimes there's not. In fact, most times they're not. So the prudent person understands the principles, but also understands how different principles interact with each other. And then the third part is just foresight. And that's where you can sort of read the situation and understand how it's going to affect other people. I mean, we all know, like our decisions, there's always some fallout, right? And there's some kind of consequences to them. And prudence helps us move towards the thing that is best. That's the other part, right? Like people often don't think about, they think about what can I do or what can I not do and still be okay. But prudence says, no, do what is the greatest good here. Right? It commands the virtues, like, and so oftentimes prudence has to command courage so that you can carry through to do something that's difficult. Like the prudent thing is to confront this person about, something they're doing in their lives that's really self-destructive, even though I'm going to feel bad about making them feel bad. So fortitude is again vital to actually carry it through. Prudence, the other part too that people often like, it's always what is like morally best, like the morally good thing to do, not like the most expedient or not what gives me like benefits me most, right? So prudence, often people are like, oh, that guy's really prudent with his money. Well, if he's just doing what's best for himself, that's not prudence. If he's using his money to do what is good, morally good, then that's prudence. All right. So you see, like it always comes back to prudence, and it always comes back to understanding principles and how they apply in a given situation. All right. Any questions on prudence? All right.
What about like I don't know, if you're like sort of over analyzing like a less important situation, like it seems like where does that fall in terms of like missing the target with prudence? Like, I'm about to, I don't know, buy a house and I don't like think about it enough versus like I'm about to buy a paintbrush and I think about it too much.
Yeah, so that part of understanding is knowing the gravity as well, right? And knowing that perhaps the maximizing the good of the paintbrush isn't worth the deliberative power of like analyzing it forever, right? Like consulting consumer reports, asking 100 people in the store, whatever you do, right? But even the prudent person even knows, morally speaking, what the best paintbrush to buy would be, right? But again, with respect to sort of over analyzing them, even over analyzing would be a lack of prudence.
But would that fall under the like astuteness or the?
Yeah. So
it doesn't matter.
Well, I mean, so it's imprudent. I hate to use, hey, it's the opposite, imprudent. But it's not, I mean, it's is overthinking a vice? I don't know, like, but yeah. But it would fall under whatever that vice is of overthinking. I'm sure St. Thomas has some Latin name for it. I don't know what it is, but overthinking would definitely be a vice. Okay, justice. Justice is a moral virtue that consists in a constant and firm will to give their due to God and neighbor. Justice toward men disposes one to respect the rights of each and to establish in human relationships the harmony that promotes equity with regard to persons and to the common good. The just man, often mentioned in sacred scripture, is distinguished by habitual right thinking and the uprightness of his conduct towards his neighbor. Okay, so justice, St. Thomas says, is to render to each man what is due to him. To render to each man what is due to him with a constant and perpetual love. So in a sense, you're willing and perpetually willing that your neighbor gets what's due to him. And so justice, which we're going to spend a whole lot of time on the rest of the semester, obviously, as we move to the second tablet where it's about love of neighbor, is the virtue that sort of governs our relationships with other people. Yes.
Is mercy a virtue?
Mercy would be a virtue, yes.
Because you mentioned like the defect of justice is things, which obviously is different than mercy.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can talk more about that when we talk about justice later on. Okay, so the just man, somebody who's just, is actually a debtor. Like this is the take home from this, right? You actually owe something. If you're just, you owe somebody something, right? You owe specifically what is due to them, right? And so then the question is, okay, what is due to somebody? What do I owe them, right? And so what I want to talk about is rights. And again, we'll spend a lot of time talking about this, yes.
Like anyone's been on kids, I feel like it's most often appeal to justice if they have any virtue. Like that's not fair. Why does he get more time than me? Why does he have more M&Ms? Like, why do you think? Why do you think kids like are
except when they mean that's not fair, what they really mean is I don't like that.
Yeah.
Right? They don't mean it in the sense of like, and fairness and justice not really the same thing, right? I mean, the M&Ms is a good example. Like, are you owed an equal amount of M&Ms? I don't know. Can you make an argument for why you should get as many M&Ms as your brother who's twice the size of you, for example, right? So yeah, usually when a kid, it appears to be justice, but what they really mean by that's not fair is I don't really like that, right? And unfortunately, in our culture, people never grow out of that, right? They never grow out of like crying foul when what they really mean is, well, I don't really like this. All right, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about rights so that we don't have to do that later. So what is a right? Okay, something you are owed. All right. Okay, so you just gave me the genus. Now, there's lots of things you're owed, right? What's the specific difference? Among the things that I'm owed, what makes it different? Yes.
You're owed something that allows you to fulfill your responsibility.
Okay, so certainly it's related to your own personal obligations. So rights and obligations have this sort of, I don't want to say inverse relationship, but this connected relationship. So think of what we're talking about, like morals, right? Morality. So a right is the moral capacity to claim from another what one deserves. Right. So in other words, if I have a right to something, someone has an obligation to make sure I have it. Yes.
Are rights always active? Because you think of like I have the right to vote, I have the right to life, I have the right. Are they always active, or are there things that you have rights that are passive?
Give me an example of like a passive right. What do you mean?
Are there any examples like?
I feel like the right to life would be passive. No. It's not like you're voting.
You have the right to live.
Let's talk a little bit more about it, and then maybe you can rephrase your question. Okay, so if justice is giving each man his due, how do we decide what's actually due to somebody? And we say, okay, all I've done is give you a word for talking about the thing, but how do you decide what they're actually due versus like, somebody claims that they have a right to, I don't know, they have a right to bacon every Thursday afternoon. Is that true? And how would you argue that it's not?
You use prudence.
Okay. So yeah, you could use prudence, but so what are the principles though? Yeah, so in a like a specific case, some dude walks up to me and goes, "It's Thursday, Rob. Where's my bacon?" I'm like, prudence might say, "I don't know. You guess you just go get your bacon yourself. I don't owe that to you." So what are the principles then of justice? Right, so let's talk about rights. Always have adjectives attached to them, and the adjective is really, really important. Right. So a natural right stem from our common human nature and are always attached to those things that lead to true human flourishing, like bacon. Right? Bacon leads to true. So he actually does have a right to bacon on every day, and not just Thursday. Maybe not on Friday. Maybe not on Friday. So those things by which human nature thrives. But this is what, in essence, the founding fathers mean by the right to the pursuit of happiness. All right, is that there's certain rights that are integral to our flourishing, or certain objects that are integral to our flourishing, such that we have rights to them. Positive rights are those things that are granted by someone in authority and are obtained by some sort of convention. The right to vote, the right to drive a car. Like civil rights are often determined by the government. Natural rights are not. Right? And so this distinction is totally lost today. People totally don't make this distinction. And it's a really important distinction. All right. How do you know someone has a right to something? I'll get to your question in 1 second. Certainly, it has to do with flourishing, but it also has to do with what their obligations are. Right. So, for example, remember we talked about the natural law. Why is the person who insists that they have the right to choose, i.e. abortion, why did they get trumped by the right to life of the child? Okay, I mean, that's why, but so what if we reframe it in terms of obligations? Okay, is there an obligation to protect life? Is there an obligation to kill a child? So who has the right, who doesn't? Right, in fact, the person that wants the abortion actually has the obligation to protect the life as well. All right, so the reason why it all gets lost is because we frame it in terms of rights instead of obligations. Yes, Keegan.
Would we call the right to abortion a positive right, or would it just not be a right at all?
Well, you can't have a right to a wrong, so it's not really a right, but in a certain sense, it's a civil right that someone in authority has deemed that they can have, or a positive right.
By that definition, the right to an abortion.
Yeah. So by those, like all things being equal, yes. Like suppose it wasn't a bad thing, right? You would say, okay, now we're just pitting a natural right versus a positive right, and still the natural right would win.
Will natural rights always trump positive rights?
Yes. Well, yes, but they ought to never also conflict, right? So they could be pointing at two different things, but they should never conflict. Yes. How to go to the universal healthcare thing. Most always can count on someone to bring up the controversial one. Yeah, well, but the practical problems actually matter, right? Okay, so let's play the game, right? And before I do that, let's go to this slide real quick, and then we'll come back to it. So Pope Benedict says, duties, obligations, reinforce rights, and call for their defense and promotion as a task to be undertaken in the service of the common good. All right, so if you ask the question, okay, is universal healthcare a right? So the first question is, okay, we would agree that taking care of someone who's sick is an obligation. Okay, so we'd start there. Okay, who has the duty to provide it?
That would say, first and foremost, those around you.
Okay. All right, let's just say it's something beyond what they can handle.
Subsidiarity, the closest person to that who actually can provide.
Okay. So don't think in terms of like, okay, if the family can't provide it, then the doctor should. Don't think in those terms. Think of which society, which level. So which level should actually provide. So yeah, so some sort of local level. So like you're saying, like family, like the family should take them to a doctor, and the doctor should do the work. Or is it the job of the state to get the doctor to take care of the person? Right? It's not clear, right? So okay, so we have what someone is saying a right, but it's not clear on who's supposed to actually provide it. So that would be the first problem with it. So the state clearly, like things we could say, the state clearly has an obligation to protect it as a right, but not necessarily to provide it. All right. So certainly if someone was abusing, they were, saw certain people walking down the road and they, dropped something in front of the hospital and made it look like a Radio Shack or something, and weren't giving, like the state would step in and say, no, you got to give health care to everybody. Okay. All right, what were you going to ask? And then we'll keep talking about it.
So, okay, so you guys you said there's a duty to take care of the sick. I think we can think of, I guess, there are kind of more clear examples where you say, okay, within a family, if somebody in your family is sick, you obviously need to take care of them. And it's not just like, oh, it's nice to take care of them. Like, it would actually be wrong for you not to take care of them. And that kind of makes sense. And I can kind of see, like, okay, in an immediate, like in an absolute emergency situation, if you're in a restaurant, somebody falls over, and is anybody here a doctor? Like, a doctor should come over and be like, I'm busy enjoying my spaghetti or whatever. And he might even say, like, it would be wrong of him to not do that. And not just nice for him to do that. I guess the question, this is probably goes back to the whole thing. Like, I guess it's easy to say, like, everybody has a right to like standard, we call it like standard or normal, like normal care, or immediate care, like an emergency. But is it like, do people have a right to month-long? And I'm not coming down. I guess my question is, because obviously a lot of advances in medical science where it's not just like we have some guy who might know a little bit more about medical science than somebody else who can kind of get advantages or something. Like there's like neurosurgery or something like that. Does everybody have like a right? Do I have the right to walk up to neurosurgery, demand neurosurgery?
Yeah. So let me go back to what you said, because this will be the launching point to start to answer the question. So you said that everyone has an obligation to like take care of a sick person, right? Did you say that at the beginning? What did you say at the beginning?
I guess to me it makes it a little. It's just if we say we have an obligation to take care, I guess if we say like we have like a true obligation that's not predicated on some sort of like locality, or like whether it be a moral locality or a physical one. It seems like you end up in a situation, okay, like we have an obligation now to go take care of people with like malaria in Africa or something like that. We have an obligation to go do that. That's not
okay, so go back to your restaurant example, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a doctor sitting right beside. I'm choking. He has an obligation to save me.
Yeah.
What if 30 people in the restaurant all at once simultaneously choke? Do all of them have the right to intervention by that doctor?
I guess they all have the right, but the doctor doesn't have the duty to respond to all of them because you can't demand impossible.
Okay, so what you're saying is like this is where healthcare as a universal right maybe not true. What you can't have a universal right to a commodity. Right. So healthcare ultimately is a commodity, right? Because it's limited by something, right? It's limited by the fact there's one doctor, suppose no one else knows the Heimlich maneuver or whatever, right? In that one restaurant. So if it's a commodity, there's no universal right to a commodity such that everyone can share in some even minimum amount, right? Even a minimum amount would somehow maybe exhaust the entire commodity. And so as a commodity, you can't necessarily say, okay, everyone has a right to equal healthcare, because it wouldn't work. Because if everyone has a right to it, then it has to exist. Could you somehow make it so that everyone receives a minimum standard of care without exhausting the commodity? Yes, right. But you can't go above and beyond that. So might someone have a universal right? Is there a universal right to immediate health care in life and death situations? Maybe. But it's a no, there's nothing not compassionate about saying there's no universal right to healthcare. I mean, it's a broken system for sure, but you can't start with the saying that everyone has a right to equal healthcare, because that's not possible. Could you start lower? Maybe, but you're still at a point of like trying to divvy up a commodity, and that's where the trouble comes in. So that's a really long answer to your question, but you have to, like, anytime I've had a discussion with someone, immediately as I begin to ask them, okay, what would that actually look like? That's usually how someone will say, okay, wait a second, this is a limited resource, so we can't guarantee it to everybody anyway. So if we can't guarantee it to everybody, then it's clear that not everybody has a right to it. And so what do they have a right to is a different question, right? And I don't necessarily have an answer, but I'm not a policymaker either, right? Yes.
So not to go too far, too down travel, but Aaron and I were discussing last night how, okay, like now, just kind of like you mentioned, medicine is treated as like more of a commodity to the point, and to a certain degree, like doctors, doctors, they perform a service, they have a right to get paid for it. But on the other hand, like you're treating with somebody where it's literally like it's somebody's life and death. Like it's not really like it's not like selling sunglasses to somebody where, okay, I made the sunglasses, you have to pay me. It's like, pay me or you're going to die kind of thing. I mean, that's not, you understand what I'm saying? Like most people don't really have a choice to buy it or not. And in the past, when medical care was simpler, you might have had religious like running the hospitals. Like it was easier because these people didn't want to be paid, or at least they weren't working for themselves. Where now you do have doctors who are in it for the money, like they do. Like that was a serious consideration of why they entered the profession. So how does that? I guess, is it true that it's a commodity, or is it, because it seems to be very different from like buying sunglasses?
I mean, it is different than that, because it's also there's also service wrapped into it too, right? And I mean, the only reason why I called it a commodity is just to show that it's limited.
Yeah.
Is it limited? But is it a pure commodity? No, it's different in the sense that it's also service wrapped into it, right? So yeah, without going any deeper into that, I will stop there.
Okay, I could ask one more.
Yeah.
So in regards to the government, obviously, I just have a couple questions about it. So in regards to government, number one, there's the question of like, okay, what rights do the government has and what doesn't, because there's a lot of, I'll be multiple things in the past year and a half that have come up where it's okay, does the government have the right to do this? Does it have the right to do this? Does the right to force me to do this?
Right. Yeah. So the role of the government is to protect and promote the common good, right? And so that again hinges on like the definition of common good, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about. But to get at your thinly veiled question, right? Public health is not a common good. Right? And the reason why public health is not a common good is because not everyone shares in it equally. Can't. It's a private good. And certainly like the government should care about public health, but ultimately it's not part of the common good, so it falls out of their purview. So they can do things like encourage people to do certain health measures that are purportedly good for them, but they can never mandate it, because their ability to bind, their authority only pertains to the common good.
And then secondly, really controversial. So America, I mean, in America, we have a long history of being concerned about the rights of the government. We don't have a long history of being concerned about the rights of like private entities. So there are, there are things where can stores require you, or can just businesses generally like require you to do, I guess, is the truly the, because normally people would say, well, you don't want that, you shouldn't shop there kind of thing, or you don't want that, you shouldn't do business with me. But it's going to get to the point where if it's not already there now, like where it becomes almost, there are some things that are so big that it's quite difficult to avoid. And also the burdens that might be placed upon somebody else, they'll just go somewhere else, like there's nowhere else to go. It's like, at what point, or is it truly, or I guess it's going to like commerce, is it truly just, as long as you're okay, I mean, I guess that's probably not, but as long as you're okay with it, this is just the contracts of money, these are the obligations.
Yeah, so it's not, wouldn't be, so again, like entities exist within a society when they contribute to the common good. And the proper authority could come down and put a thumb on a business that's not contributing, that's actually doing things contrary to the common good. Yes, Ryan.
I would just say that would be a bit of a gap. It's the same. Sure, I know what you're probably talking about right now, but at the same time, the argument can be made for why isn't the bakery allowed to, like, why can't we force the bakery to make the wedding cake?
Yeah, and the answer to the question would be, like, you can answer that question. You could say, because gay marriage doesn't contribute to the common good, therefore they're under no obligation to, but you could argue other things do. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the common good. Like, we can come back to that. I don't want to get too, because we could talk about that for a long time. All right, so different types of justice. One distinguishes community justice from legal justice. So justice essentially rules when there's essentially three relationships, right? There's individuals one to another, that's commutative justice, right? So think like transactional, like I pay you X dollars, you give me X dollars worth of goods. And then there's the social whole to the individual, and that's called distributive justice. And then there's the individual's obligation to society, and we call that either legal justice or social justice. And again, we're going to come back to those a lot, but just think of, it's just about the relationships, right? Relationship between equals, relationship of society to the individual, and then individual to society. All right, and we'll talk about all three of those. Yes, Connor.
Can you say that the names again?
Yeah, sure. Commutative is person to person, like equal to equal. Distributive is society to individual, and then individual to society is legal justice, or sometimes they'll call it social justice. I think social justice probably isn't used as much now because of SJWs. Anyway, temperance. Man naturally desires pleasures that are becoming to him, since however man is such as a rational being, it follows that those pleasures are becoming to man, which are in accord with reason. All right, so temperance, we said, controls the concupiscible appetite. But what I don't want us to think about, right? So temperance, again, like some of these words get twisted and they don't mean what they really mean. And we hear like, think temperance, we think temperance movement, right? We're in like the 20s or whatever it was, where the temperance movement was basically no alcohol at all, right? Not moderating. So by moderate, they just meant by moderating, it meant get rid of it. But temperance isn't about limiting pleasure. It's about ordering it to right reason. All right, so think about eating a meal, right? So there's pleasure found in eating, but through the virtue of temperance, you can have joy by sharing a meal with somebody else. All right, so temperance allows us to take pleasure in the object and not pleasure itself. And so think about that for a second, right? Very often we like the pleasure itself. So pleasure becomes the end, whereas what we should really like is the thing that causes us pleasure. All right. So that in mind, let's talk about this. This could be a long rabbit hole as well. Some of you will, at least who are around for Theology of the Body over the summer. Why is chastity so hard? I feel like you're cheating if you answer that.
It's connected. It's because the passion is so strong because it's so important. So
okay,
passion makes it difficult.
So the sex drive is so. Why is the sex drive so strong though? Why did God wire us that way? Why did he make
I
that
think,
so?
I mean, I would say it's because it, you know, that love between husband and wife like that is like kind of the closest you can get to God before you really start crossing into the supernatural. I don't know. It seems like naturally speaking, like the most, I don't know, like
I would love this answer if you were more confident in saying it, because you're saying the right answer, Kevin. Say it with confidence. Right?
yeah,
It's the strongest like desire because it's the strongest love, right? And if the desire wasn't so strong, we wouldn't be able to do it. Right? Like what it's actually asking of us is hard. Like, and that's not because we lack chastity, it's because of what it is. Right. And so God puts this desire in us that's so strong it pushes us towards that. Right. And we just have to accept that that's the way it is, right? And that's not because we're broken. That's that part is how we're wired. Ryan, what were you gonna add on top of that?
The drive, like what chastity pushes us to do is to give ourselves fully to someone else and to totally sacrifice your entire life for someone else to help. So you need to have something that's strong enough.
Yes.
To do what you need to.
Yes. All right. So who can give me? We'll go through this kind of fast because it's 6 o'clock. Who can give me a positive definition of chastity?
chastity is the freedom to love. Words of Rob.
Oh, Kevin, you cheated. All right, like totally ruined it. So we view, like, if you want to really learn about chastity, read Love and Responsibility. But John Paul II has this whole chapter called the Rehabilitation of Chastity. And what he talks about is essentially that for the longest time, we've viewed chastity as, well, he calls it one long no, right? Where we tend to think of chastity as no, 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 no. Like, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. But what he wants us to see is that chastity is actually yes. It's one yes, which carries with it a whole bunch of other no's, right? My one yes to this one person means no to all the others, right? And maybe I haven't made my yes to a person yet. And so I say no to all the others because that person still exists, right? I just haven't said yes to them yet, right? And so don't think of chastity in a negative way, right? Because if you do, then when you get to marriage, you're like, oh, I'm good now. Like, I'm totally free to do whatever I want. And you'll give away your freedom, right? So chastity, like as a sub virtue of temperance, is not about like saying no or limiting pleasure. It's about using the pleasure in the way it was meant to be used, right? And so it's saying yes. And ultimately, this is what you have to be convinced about, right? Is that what chastity does is, to Kevin's point, it frees you up to love, right? Because I'm no longer led around by my feelings, right? I can actually make an act of the will and my feelings follow, which means I've made a freer gift of myself. All right. And that's so counterintuitive to what the culture tells you. But, you know, that's why, like, you see all these surveys, right? And like married people, especially married people who practice NFP, like, not to be blunt, but like their sexual satisfaction is like off the charts, right? Because they're like doing it the right way, right? And that's really important, right? And so the chaste man enjoys the marital embrace with his wife way more than the unchaste guy hopping around beds on a college campus, right? And the guy hopping around beds on a college campus is empty because of it, right? So chastity is a good thing, and don't think of it in terms of being a negative thing. And so it says only the chaste man and chaste woman are capable of true love. For chastity frees their association, including their marital intercourse, and that tendency to use a person. All right. Any questions? All right. Last one, fortitude. Fortitude, which is just courage, ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of the good. All right. So think back of my examples of like having to strive for the good that's hard to get to. All right. Without, especially when evil is hard to avoid. And think like courage is moral courage, right? Like, doesn't really matter how strong you are. right? It's your willingness. Well, it's really like the willingness to die in battle, right? To know where your hill is, go up the hill and be willing to die there. That's courage. All right. And of course, prudence goes hand in hand with it, right? Because I got to know, like, okay, this is my hill, that's not. So some key like sub virtues are like patience is one of them, right? Endurance. And in the midst of like courageous acts, again, if I do them promptly and firmly and do them with joy, that's the courageous act. And we'll talk more about this. What I want to do though is focus on one sub virtue, which some of you have seen this before, but it tends to be a lot of people don't even know what this virtue is. How many of you know what magnanimity is? Awesome, that's good. Okay. Magnanimity is the stretching of the mind. I know I have 4 in there. Of the mind to great things and things that are deserving of honor. Magnanimity makes a man deem himself worthy of great things in consideration of the gifts he holds from God. So you guys know who Flannery O'Connor was? So Flannery O'Connor was a Catholic author. And one time somebody asked her, they were interviewing, they said, "Why do you write?" And she said, "I write because I write well." That was her answer. And people were like, could you be any more arrogant? Why isn't that arrogant? Yeah, that's magnanimous. What were you going to say, Ryan?
I was gonna say, it reminds me of humility. That what the definition of seeing and stating, actually is, if you know it well, it's just like
Yeah, so like humility becomes the linchpin to magnanimity, right? So and immediately, like as Christians, we think, well, what do you mean stretch towards great things? That's pride. Why? I can't do that. Like, no, we were made for great things, right? That's what we were made for. Like every gift God gave us was meant to be used in the service of something great, right? And so the word magnanimity literally means large soul. Right? It's this idea of having like being big souled, right? And unfortunately, it's like the smallest virtue in modernity, right? Like people are they're okay with just the status quo, right? Not doing great things, being comfortable. And we have to understand, like that's one of the ways the devil will always tempt us, right? Like your choice always is discomfort versus comfort. Which one do you choose? Jesus said to do what? Pick up your cross, right? So you choose the thing that has more of the cross in it every single time. But that's the path to joy. But the person who does it is the person who has magnanimity, right? Has the courage to go, okay, like I have certain things that I'm willing to die for, and I have certain principles I will not yield on, so I won't yield on this, right? I have certain gifts that I want to put at the service of mankind, and I'm going to do it in the greatest way possible. Like that's what we were made for. We were made to be that way, and we're selling ourselves short if we have what magnanimity actually protects us from is false humility, right? Ultimately, right? To Ryan's point, like humility is truth, seeing things and seeing ourselves as we really are, right? Seeing what my gifts really are, and then doing great things with our gifts. And that takes a ton of courage, right? That's why magnanimity is a sub virtue of courage. And so we just have to make sure, like, we spend a lot of time as Christians focusing on like our defects and our weaknesses, but not enough time focusing. Like, if I sat down with you right now and I said, "Okay, give me your 5 strengths," how many think you can answer that? Like, you don't have to raise your hand. I'm just saying, like I don't know if even I can answer it. Like, could I be honest enough and humble enough to go, here's the 5 gifts God gave me that I need to put in service of mankind, right? That I need to put in the service of the church, that I need to glorify Him with, right? Like, you guys ever seen Chariots of Fire? There's a great scene in there where the guy, they asked him how he is so fast, and he says, "I am so fast because I glorify God with every step that I make." Right? He's running, right? And he's like, I was made for this. and every step I make glorifies God. That's a magnanimous soul. I mean, like we sell ourselves short and we can't, right? This is my little soapbox moment. Like strive for great things and the world will change. Like you get enough people doing that. You get enough people who are like, yeah, I'm not just striving for the status quo. I'm selling out on comfort. I'm leaning into discomfort because I want to do great things. All right, questions? Yes.
You would say like when Aquinas said all my work is straw, that wasn't him like being contrary to magnanimity.
No, so yeah. So